I always thought that Megan's extended business trips were routine, a necessary part of her position, which had grown more demanding over the years. Her recent one, though, stretched on longer than usual. She called the first night she arrived, promising to call back each night. But then there were only short texts, often riddled with excuses about late dinners, team-building exercises, or impromptu client meetings. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to trust her, to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut that something was very, very wrong. One Friday night, after yet another cancellation, I found myself pacing in our bedroom, unable to shake the suspicion that had taken root. My mind replayed the events of the last few months. Her unexplained expenses, the subtle changes in her demeanor, her sudden fixation on staying in shape, and the time she spent on her appearance. At first, I dismissed it all as paranoia, but I knew I had to confirm it for myself, if only to put my own mind at ease. I couldn't keep wondering lying awake in a cold bed waiting for her. I hired a private investigator, a decision that felt like betrayal in itself, but one I could barely afford not to make. He'd been efficient and thorough. Within 2 weeks, he confirmed what I'd feared. Megan wasn't on a business trip, at least not the kind she'd told me about. She was spending her nights in a rented apartment with some younger guy. It turned out she wasn't just meeting him for the occasional drink. She was financing his life. She'd set him up with his own apartment, where they'd spend weekends together, where they'd been using our hard-earned savings. I felt sick reading the reports, looking at the pictures. Her betrayal wasn't just about intimacy. She was supporting him, paying his rent, handling his bills, and even slipping him cash. I sat at my desk that night, numb, staring at a spreadsheet that showed our financials. Each line was a punch to the gut. We'd worked for years to save, to build something for our future. I'd taken on extra work, cut back on things I loved, all while she was bleeding us dry for a man half my age. Revenge was never something I'd considered. I was never that kind of guy. But something broke inside me that night, something I'd never find again. I knew that if Megan could live her fantasy, so could I. I didn't need to hide in the shadows or feel like I was the one destroying us. She'd done that all on her own. And that's when an idea struck, a twisted idea that both disgusted and exhilarated me. If she was out living some wild affair with her young lover, why couldn't I have a taste of that thrill too? I thought of her lover's mother, a woman I'd seen a few times, who had that same youthful charm despite her age, an undeniable allure I'd once been tempted by. Maybe it was time to reach out. The next day I looked her up, unsure if I was really going to go through with it. But when I sent the message, she responded quickly. The conversation was casual at first, two strangers making small talk, but I could feel the pull, the electricity. She was flirtatious, intrigued, and that was all the encouragement I needed. Megan wasn't the only one who could make her own rules. When I met up with her lover's mother, let's call her Laura, I hadn't really planned out what I'd say. I didn't even know if I'd go through with anything beyond a drink and conversation. But when she greeted me with that easy smile and a warm hug, something in me let go of any hesitation. Here was a woman who was quick to laugh, who listened, who even seemed to read between my pauses, knowing something deeper was going on. It felt strange to be sitting across from her, nursing a beer, knowing the bitter irony of our connection. The conversation started light enough, but the tension built. I'd catch her eyes lingering on mine just a second too long, her hand reaching across the table to brush against mine as she made a point, each touch deliberate. As the night went on, I found myself talking about things I hadn't said out loud in months. The fights Megan and I had swept under the rug, the way she drifted, the emptiness I'd felt long before her so-called business trip started. Laura listened, nodding, letting out soft laughs of understanding. Her empathy wasn't just a front. She knew the sting of betrayal. There was a hint of vulnerability in her eyes, a glimmer that said she'd been disappointed, too, left behind and looking for connection. By the time the bar was closing, I knew where the night was headed. Laura invited me to her place, and I didn't hesitate. When we walked inside, she offered me a glass of whiskey, and we sat together on her couch, talking in hushed tones. Her laugh was soft, her hand on my shoulder comforting, and suddenly I felt a hunger I hadn't realized was there. Her touch didn't feel like an escape or a distraction. It felt real, like something I could trust, even if it was only for one night. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were kissing, slow at first, testing boundaries, but then she pulled me closer, and I felt myself meld into it, forgetting the betrayal, the anger, the months of emptiness. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be desired, to be someone's focus, to feel warmth. As we moved to her bedroom, I realized I didn't feel guilt. Megan had burned through that when she emptied our accounts, when she chose to sneak around rather than face me, when she lied night after night. Now I was choosing something for myself, something that felt oddly liberating even if it was fleeting. The next morning as I was getting dressed, Laura sat on the edge of the bed, watching me with a smile, as if she understood that this night had been as much about reclaiming a part of myself as it had been about revenge. "Will I see you again?" she asked, her voice soft, hesitant. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to keep this going, but I knew this was a path that only led to more complications. I gave her a long look, shrugging with a half-smile. "Maybe," I said, though we both understood that we'd probably go back to our separate lives. But later, as I drove home, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Megan had made her choice. Now I'd made mine. Only, I didn't realize then that Megan's lover was going to find out. It didn't take long before the fallout began. I hadn't expected word to travel fast, but it did. A week after my night with Laura, I noticed Megan acting strange. She'd been coming home later than usual, and when she did, her face was set in a tense, pinched expression, her eyes darting away from mine. Part of me thought she'd found out about Laura, but how could she? I hadn't breathed a word of it to anyone, and I was certain Laura wouldn't jeopardize her own son by spilling it. Still, the tension was palpable, and I almost felt a flicker of guilt until I remembered the lies and betrayal she'd already served me in spades. Then one evening, I got a message from an unknown number. The text was short, seething with venom. "So this is how it is? Sleeping with my mother? You're just as twisted as she is?" My heart sank as I realized exactly who it was. Megan's lover had found out. I didn't respond. I didn't even know what to say. But a strange satisfaction simmered in my chest. He'd gotten a taste of his own medicine, the bitter sting of betrayal. But if he was angry enough to send that message, there was no telling what he might do next. That night, Megan came home, tossing her purse on the table with a little too much force, then eyeing me as if she'd finally decided to address the elephant in the room. "Do you have something you want to tell me?" she asked, crossing her arms. There was a glint of something dark in her gaze, a mix of anger and strangely fear. "Me?" I asked, feigning innocence, though my heart was pounding. "No, Megan. I think it's you who has something to explain." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I saw a crack in her resolve. But she quickly covered it up, brushing a hand through her hair and shrugging. "Fine. You want honesty? I'll give it to you. I was seeing someone. It was a mistake, okay? But it didn't mean anything." The words were as hollow as I'd expected. She stared at me, defiant but uncomfortable, as if daring me to say something that would give her an excuse to lash out. But I just stared back, waiting. Finally, she broke the silence. "I don't know why you're so calm about this." She spat, clearly unnerved. "It's almost like you don't even care." "Oh, I care," I replied, smiling grimly. "But I'm also not stupid, Megan. I know how long this has been going on. I know how much of our money you poured into his life. I know about the apartment you got him." She went pale, her defiance crumbling in an instant. "You got me followed?" Her voice was shaking now, a mix of anger and panic. "Do you even realize how much you've invaded my privacy?" "That was it." I laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the room. "Privacy? You want to talk about privacy after everything you've done behind my back?" She turned on her heel, reaching for her purse. "I can't believe you," she muttered, heading toward the door. "Go ahead, run off to him," I said, my voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "He's probably going to be real interested to know about who I spent my last weekend with." She stopped dead in her tracks, turning slowly to face me. Her eyes searched mine, desperately trying to find the lie, the bluff. But I just stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the truth to hit her. Finally, she choked out, "Who? You remember his mother, don't you?" I replied, my voice soft but sharp as a blade. Lovely woman. She's good company, Megan. Real good company. Her face twisted in horror and anger, a mess of emotions she couldn't contain. You're disgusting, she hissed, her voice barely a whisper. But there was something else there, too. A trace of fear. Like she realized for the first time just how far she'd pushed me. She didn't say another word. She just stormed out, slamming the door behind her, leaving me in the silence of the house that once felt like home, but now felt like a prison. I waited, knowing that the storm was far from over. The next few days were quiet, but the silence felt loaded, like the tense calm before a storm. Megan hadn't come home since our confrontation. Part of me was relieved. Seeing her would have been like ripping open a wound that was barely starting to scar over. But the other part of me was restless, wondering what her next move would be. Then one evening, I got another text from Megan's lover. This one was different. Gone was the sneering arrogance, the taunting from before. Instead, he was desperate. What the hell did you do? I haven't heard from her in days. Are you happy now? I stared at my phone, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. This kid, barely old enough to know what commitment even meant, was reeling from the fallout of a game he'd never been ready to play. And Megan, well, she was no better. She had used both of us, drained our savings, lied at every turn, and now she was hiding from the mess she'd made. I decided to call her, hoping that I'd catch her off guard and force her to answer for herself. After several rings, she finally picked up. What do you want? She muttered, her voice a strained mix of exhaustion and irritation. We're not done here, Megan, I replied. You can't just run off and pretend none of this happened. You owe me an explanation. An explanation? She scoffed, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. What's left to explain? You found out, didn't you? You went out of your way to destroy everything, and for what? To make yourself feel better? Destroy everything? I let out a bitter laugh. You're the one who decided to ruin this marriage the minute you started sneaking around with some kid. You lied to me. You drained our savings. Hell, you even gave him an apartment, Megan. An apartment? Do you know how that makes me feel? There was a long pause, the kind where you know the person on the other end is grasping for words. She sounded smaller than I'd ever heard her, almost fragile. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It just happened. It just happened? That's the best you can come up with? You were using me to fund your little love nest, all while pretending you were working late. Do you even realize how pathetic that sounds? I didn't try to hide the contempt in my voice. She sighed, a long, heavy sound that was both an admission and a resignation. Fine, you're right, okay? I messed up. I got in too deep, and I didn't know how to stop. But you don't get to act like some saint in all this. Oh, trust me, I'm not a saint, I shot back. But I didn't go behind your back, Megan. I didn't bleed us dry for some fling. I paused, letting the words sink in. Maybe if you hadn't been so busy playing house with him, you'd still have some respect left for yourself. There was a crack in her voice when she finally responded. So what now? You just get to walk away from all this, feeling like you've won? That's not what this is about. I replied, this is about accountability. You owe me for what you've done. You owe yourself some honesty too. Maybe it's time you face the fact that you're not the person you pretend to be. The line went silent. I could almost hear her processing the weight of those words, the truth settling over her like a heavy fog. She didn't respond, and I didn't push her to. After a long, tense pause, she simply said, I'll be by tomorrow to get some of my things. The call ended, but the tension lingered, thick and stifling. I sat back, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. She was coming back, if only for a short time, to gather up her life and face the mess she'd left in her wake. It wasn't closure, but it was something. The next day as I waited for her, I caught myself looking around the house that we had built together. The pictures on the walls, the little reminders of a life that now felt like someone else's. I'd thought that confronting her would make me feel better, but all it did was deepen the void. The sense of loss that had been building ever since I discovered her betrayal. When she finally arrived, she barely looked at me as she walked through the house, gathering up clothes and toiletries in silence. I didn't say anything either. There was nothing left to say. But as she left, a strange thought crossed my mind. This wasn't just the end of a marriage. This was the end of the person I had been, the person I had let her turn me into. And in that strange silence, I realized it was finally time to let go of her and everything she'd taken from me. Megan's departure was supposed to feel like closure, but instead of relief, I felt an unsettling emptiness take its place. The anger, the need for revenge, the desire to make her pay, they'd driven me for weeks. But now, in the stillness of a half-empty house, I was left with only questions. How had I let things get this far without seeing the signs? How had we fallen so completely apart? And what was left for me now? A few days after she took her things, I decided to reach out to Laura, her lover's mother, once more. I didn't know if it was loneliness, curiosity, or something darker, but I needed someone who understood, someone who had been hurt by the same betrayal. She picked up after the first ring. "David?" Her voice was gentle, hesitant. "Hey, Laura," I replied, feeling a warmth in my chest that surprised me. "I just wanted to check in. It's been a rough week." There was a pause, then a soft sigh. "I know what you mean. Things have been complicated on my end, too." We met that night, sitting together on the same worn couch where we'd first connected. She offered me a glass of wine, and we settled into a familiar rhythm of conversation. It felt natural, like talking to an old friend. She shared stories about her son, his troubled relationships, and the strain of feeling like she was losing him to the toxic path he'd chosen. In turn, I told her about the anger I still carried, the nagging sense that even with Megan gone, I was haunted by what she'd done. As the night wore on, there was an intimacy between us, a quiet understanding that only those who've been wounded in the same way can share. She reached out, placing her hand on mine. "It's not easy letting go of someone who was supposed to be your partner," she whispered. "But sometimes you have to." Our eyes met, and there was an unspoken understanding that neither of us was looking for love or even comfort. It was a mutual need to feel understood, to feel less alone in the ruins left by those we trusted. This time, as we moved closer, it wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming something we'd lost, our sense of worth, of being desired, even if only for a moment. The next morning as I was leaving, she stopped me at the door, her face thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice quiet, "I think we're both finally ready to move on." I nodded, feeling a strange sense of finality. Whatever this was, it had given both of us a strange kind of closure, a shared wound that we were ready to heal. When I returned home, there was another message waiting for me, this time from Megan. She wanted to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed, curious about what more she could possibly want to say. We met at a cafe on the other side of town, where no one knew us, and she looked haggard, worn down in a way that made her look like a stranger. She fidgeted with her coffee cup, avoiding my eyes. "I've been doing some thinking," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But I was hoping that maybe we could try to work through this somehow. Maybe counseling? A fresh start?" I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that surprised even me. "A fresh start? Megan, the only fresh start I need is one without you in it." Her face crumpled, her eyes filling with a mix of anger and regret. "So that's it? You're willing to throw away everything we built over one mistake?" "One mistake." I shot back, the anger surging up all over again. "You emptied our accounts for him, lied to me every day, and now you want to pretend it was just one slip-up." She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Look, Megan, I'm done. I'm moving on, and you need to do the same. Whatever we had, it's gone. You made sure of that." There was a silence between us, a finality that hung heavy in the air. I stood up to leave, but before I turned, I looked back at her one last time. "Goodbye, Megan." As I walked away, I felt the weight lifting, the anger and betrayal dissolving into something closer to peace. The weeks following that final meeting with Megan were surprisingly calm. The storm had passed, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I busied myself with work, spent time with friends, and tried to reclaim parts of myself I'd let go of over the years. There was an undeniable loneliness that crept in, especially at night, but it was different now. More like an empty space waiting to be filled than a wound. Laura and I stayed in touch, occasionally exchanging texts, checking in on each other's progress. We'd both been through hell, and that shared experience made it feel like we had this invisible bond. One Saturday afternoon, she invited me over for a quiet dinner. No pretense, no expectations, just two people who understood each other's hurt, enjoying each other's company. We shared a simple meal, and the conversation flowed easily, lighter this time, free from the weight of betrayal. We laughed, reminiscing over small, unrelated things, sidestepping the heavy topics that had brought us together in the first place. By the time dessert came around, I found myself smiling more than I had in months. As I was about to leave, Laura walked me to the door, her hand lingering on mine a little longer than necessary. She smiled, a warmth in her eyes that reminded me how far we'd both come since that first fraught meeting. "David, I want you to know that you deserve better," she said softly. "We both do," I replied, meaning every word. "You too." Driving home, I realized how different this felt. For so long, I'd been driven by anger, by a need to get even, to make someone feel the pain Megan had caused. But now, that anger had given way to something gentler, something closer to forgiveness. Not for Megan exactly, but for myself. I hadn't been perfect either. I'd let things slide, ignored the signs, and maybe even stopped trying somewhere along the way. We'd both made mistakes, but now I was ready to leave them behind. It wasn't long after that when I got another unexpected message, this time from Megan's young lover. His words were frantic, almost pleading. "She told me everything. She told me about you and my mom. I can't believe she'd do this to me. I thought she loved me." I stared at the message, feeling a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to reply, to throw back some cutting remark, to remind him of the mess he'd willingly jumped into. But instead I just put my phone down. He wasn't my responsibility, and I was done with revenge. He'd created his own problems, and now he could deal with the fallout just like I had. A few days later, I heard from Megan again. Her message was short, apologetic, as if she'd finally come to terms with the choices she'd made. She said she was moving out of state, looking to start fresh, somewhere new. She thanked me in a way for forcing her to face the consequences. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. She chose her path, and I'd chosen mine. With her gone, I felt a strange sense of freedom. The weight of her betrayal, of the endless drama, was finally lifting. I'd survived, even if I was a bit more bruised and battered than I'd ever expected. And as I looked out over the empty, quiet house that had once been full of memories, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was a new beginning. And for the first time in as long as I could remember, that idea didn't scare me. It felt like hope. Months passed, and the house slowly transformed. The spaces once filled with reminders of Megan were repurposed, redecorated. Rooms that once felt haunted were now my own. I even started a small renovation project, something I'd always talked about but never had the time or energy to begin. My life, once so centered around the marriage and the expectations that came with it, began to feel like mine again, pieced together in small ways that brought a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. One weekend, Laura invited me over again, this time for a casual gathering with some of her friends. I was hesitant at first, not sure if I was ready to meet new people or dive back into a social scene, but she insisted. "You need to get out, David," she'd said with a playful smile. "It's time." The night was easy, filled with laughter and good food. Laura's friends were warm, welcoming, and by the end of the evening, I found myself feeling lighter, even hopeful. I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply enjoy the company of others without the baggage of the past weighing me down. Laura pulled me aside as I was leaving, her hand resting on my arm. "See? It's not so bad out here in the world," she teased. I laughed genuinely. "You're right. Thanks for inviting me. I think I needed this." From that point on, Laura and I grew closer. There was no urgency, no need to define whatever it was we shared. We'd both been burned before, and that shared caution created an understanding between us, a comfort in not rushing things. Our connection grew naturally, built on trust, laughter, and the steady friendship that had started during one of the darkest points in our lives. One evening, as we sat in her backyard watching the sun dip below the horizon, Laura turned to me, a thoughtful look in her eyes. She began slowly. I used to think that after everything that happened, I'd never be able to trust anyone again. But somehow, being with you, it feels safe. Like I can start over without the past hanging over me. I nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle over us. I know what you mean. For the first time, I feel like I'm not carrying all that anger and hurt anymore. It's just gone. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. Then maybe this is our second chance. As the months turned to a year, Laura and I continued to build something that felt real, grounded in everything we'd been through, but not defined by it. Megan's shadow had faded, and thoughts of revenge or bitterness no longer lingered. I even found myself grateful, in a strange way. Never found the person who saw me for who I was, unburdened by expectations or pretense. One evening, I returned to the house and stood in the entryway, looking around at the walls I'd repainted, the photos I'd reframed, the spaces I'd made my own. The transformation was complete, inside and out, and for the first time, I felt like the past was truly behind me. As I moved forward with Laura, I knew that life wasn't about forgetting or erasing what had happened. It was about reclaiming, rebuilding, and realizing that sometimes the worst heartbreaks can lead you exactly where you're meant to be. And standing there in the warmth and quiet of my home, I knew I'd finally arrived.